going to give folks a little bit to filter in as we get the webinar started. All right, it looks like folks are going to keep filtering in as the evening goes, but I think I'll kick us off. Thanks everyone so much for coming and for being here to talk about the topic of land and farmland access. As relates to the theme of the conference, we of course can't have a resilient local and regional food system if we don't have protected and accessible and affordable farmland. So thanks for spending your Thursday evening on this topic and with these wonderful women. And so I just wanted to give us an orientation of how we're going to spend the next 75 minutes together. I'll start us off and introduce our 4 panelists. They're going to talk for about the first half of our time together, and then we'll transition into a question and answer. So as the panelists are speaking, we invite you in the bottom right corner to respond with any comments or things that you want to share with the other panelists, things that excite you, use the chat. If you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll be tracking those. And then once we get into the Q&A session, we will start asking those questions of our panelists. And just a note, if you're putting a chat into the chat box, make sure you say chat to the participants and attendees. Otherwise, just those of us on the panel will see it. And we want to make sure that everyone can see your comments. So 3 of us students, Abby, myself, and Tim Ibbotson-Sindelar put this panel together because we are really excited to listen and learn from these 4 women panelists who have thought and worked deeply and critically on topics of land access. But I wanted to start us off by acknowledging that land is a really complex topic, and land access and ownership and control are and have been used as instruments of power on multiple scales and in different ways through our history. The US itself operates on a history of stolen and dispossessed land, not only from Indigenous people, but more recently from minority farmers through both our policies and practices. And I'm really excited to learn from these 4 women how they have worked to address that history, but also acknowledge that this panelist consists of white women. And so there's a slice that they can speak to and a slice that they're unable to. And so with that, I'll introduce the 4 women who we're about to hear from. The first is Holly Rippon-Butler, who's the Land Campaign Director at the National Young Farmers Coalition. Megan Browning is the Database and Relationships Manager at the Agrarian Trust. Chelsea Gazzillo is the Working Lands Alliance Director at the American Farmland Trust. And Susan Mitchell is the farmer and owner of Cloverleaf Farm up in Northeast Connecticut. So with that, I will turn it over to Holly.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for being here and for having me. I was at the very first Yale Food System Symposium, I think many years ago, and it's really nice to see how this effort has continued and is bringing so many people together around this important topic. So I work with the National Young Farmers Coalition, as Katie said. I live in upstate New York near Saratoga Springs, Mohican, and Abenaki land. And I wanted to acknowledge this and invite those of you who have access to the chat to share the native land where you're joining from. And Abby will share a resource as well if you're not sure. And we start this way, and I want to acknowledge native land because as Katie said, we're talking about land, which is such a fundamental resource and aspect of all of our lives. And we are on Indigenous land here in what we now call the United States. And so grounding in that and wanting to just share a little bit first, I'll put up my slides and share a little bit about the National Young Farmers Coalition. I should also say I use she, her pronouns, and I've been working with young farmers since 2014, and we are a national grassroots network of farmers and ranchers and supporters, and we're helping farmers get organized around the country to have a voice in policy and to organize in their local communities. And we're also providing business services to farmers to support them in the work that they do. So I, since I joined Young Farmers Coalition, have been working on the topic of land, and it's a real privilege and challenge and complex thing to be representing the needs and voices of farmers across the country on this topic. But what I am going to share with you all today is just a little bit of a framing for the conversation that we're having. And this is based on a recent report that we put out, our land policy report. And we released this along with a website that has farmer case studies and a policy library. And we're continuing to grow this resource. But in the report, what we did was try to explain the issue, what's going on, why is land access such a challenge, and to dig deeper and say, what are the underlying forces and how is this all connected to policy? And so that's what I want to do today, is just give you a little bit of a framing of what's going on with land in the United States and why is it so challenging for growers to access this land, and why, and what can we do about it? There'll be a little bit of that at the end, and then and I think some of the other panelists will cover that as well. So as Katie, sort of said, land is really fundamental and complex piece of what we do as growers and farmers. And I think it's really important to just acknowledge this basic assumption of private property, which is a tool. It's a construct, and it comes out of the settler colonial framework. It was designed to commoditize land, make it into a commodity that can be bought and sold, and to help certain individuals at the time, white men, who could own that land and then accumulate wealth and power. And this framework was, the land itself was dispossessed and stolen, and billions of acres were taken from indigenous people. But the framework itself is a form of dispossession, because once you've created this legal identity for how land can be bought and sold, you've taken away a form of relating to the land that was different than that construct. So I want to acknowledge that and say that history is incredibly important to what we're dealing with today and some of the challenges. And I think the other panelists also will speak to some of the ways that we can and should be working within that system. If we're not going to, overthrow the private property system tomorrow, maybe there are ways that we can work within that to relate to the land differently and to create a world in which land can be a resource for vibrant communities and resilience, rather than a commodity that we're extracting wealth and resources from. And that's the goal, I think, of the policy work that we want to be doing around land, as well as things that move and support us towards that view. So just as a big picture background, what's going on with farmland in the US? There are about 900 million acres of land that's used for agriculture, according to the USDA census. And that's about half of the land base in the country, but only a very small percentage of that is devoted to actually growing food. And it's pretty much all in cropland, or all cropland, and a good chunk of pasture and rangeland is owned privately. The US government owns quite a bit of farmland as well, mostly rangeland. And there's this growing trend of farmland being owned by non-farmers. And I think that that's something that we're really paying attention to, and that stands out to me as one of the key indicators of the larger challenges that we have around land. And there's a lot of consolidation as well in this ownership. About 7% of farms are operating 41% of the farmland. So this is a big deal, because this land represents a lot of wealth and resources. There's about $2.58 trillion tied up in the value of all this real estate. And that is that's value that belongs to those landowners, those private landowners, and the individuals who, as non-farmers, are really holding this land as investment, not to grow food. And the bigger picture here is that 98% of all farmland is owned by white landowners, and a huge percentage of all farmers are white. And this is true for landowners as well, and a large percentage are male. But these numbers kind of gloss over who are the people who are actually doing the growing on this land, or who might be renting the land. And we see, but just a huge percentage, almost all of the land. And what I kind of want to get at in this presentation is that that's no accident. It's a real, it's a design of policy. And just briefly, like, why does this matter to farmers? Land is incredibly critical for so many aspects of life in general, but for a farmer, it's their security to be able to plan for the future. It's where they'll live. It's how you can invest in, make long-term investments in your business. It's really critical for mental health as well for a lot of farmers, just the ability to feel that you have a sense of place and security. And especially in the face of climate change, also having the security to make long-term decisions on the land is really important. So, when we talk about why land matters, it's all of these things. It's also, land security is something we talk a lot about, not necessarily land ownership. And I think Megan will talk more about that, but it's this piece of just having the ability to be on the land and make long-term decisions that's so critical for farmers. So I just want to give I'm trying to do this really quickly, but give a very brief history of the policy levers and tools that have been at play. And I'm not giving a list of specific policies. I think that history is very important, and I encourage people to dig into it. And we do talk a bit about it in the land report. But I think what I want to highlight and point out is that there are specific strategies and ways that policy can be used, because I think there's a lot of power in understanding that. When we understand how policy has been used for oppression, we can understand how to use it for liberation and justice. And so, in terms of the specific intersection of policy and land, this goes way back to voting and the initial ability to access these halls of power and the legislature. And you had to own land to be able to vote, and you could only own land if you were white and male. And so there's this like deep intersection between those two. And then once people were in power, they could craft policies that kept them there and kept the resources in their hands. So we've seen policy used to take land away from Indigenous people, to fractionate the ownership of that land, and dispossession from many other communities of color as well. And we've seen redistribution of land that has been taken and given to white people through homestead acts and others. And then we've seen policy being used to prevent access to land, to say certain groups cannot buy land or own land. We've seen policy used to deny access to the resources that are critical to access land, such as we've seen through redlining and discrimination in our farm lending system. And then, once you've got land, you can have programs and policies that funnel government funds to landowners without being explicitly discriminatory, but that continues to have a cumulative effect. And these things are all taking place through the executive level, at legislative, through the courts, and also administratively, and just how programs are implemented on the ground. And alongside all of these things that were happening in policy, there was a lot of actual like physical intimidation and violence that was sanctioned through policy as well. So what's the point? Public policy has shaped our food system. We need to look to policy and address the future that we want through policy. And I think that that's just the real, like the important key takeaway point that the report makes and that I want to make tonight. Why now? We're at a moment of land transition. Landowners are aging. We really have both a critical issue happening with this land transition because of these trends of non-farmer ownership and farmland investment, and kind of the continuation of who this land will probably go to if we don't do anything, knowing our breakdown of demographics of land ownership and all that. But we also have an opportunity in this moment as a lot of land is changing hands. We can use that as an opportunity to change the picture of who has access to this resource and how we structure that. So I won't go through this, but in the report, we have a couple things. One is a kind of a framework for this policy change and suggestions, principles, guiding principles for policymakers around how to approach policy. And we also have specific policy suggestions. And I just wanted to flash 2 slides very quickly of some things that are in play, leave you all with some hope and excitement. And I know Chelsea will talk a little bit in more detail, but at the federal level, recently the Justice for Black Farmers Act and the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act are two pieces of legislation that deal with land justice at the federal level that have been introduced in the Senate and are in play right now. And HR 40 is a bill that would establish a committee to study and provide recommendations for reparations for Black farmers. And that bill has been in play for a long time, but just recently, just last week, there was a hearing on it. So we've seen some movement there. Lots of exciting things at the state level. And I won't go into all of these, but just wanted to mention that there's some things going on. The New Mexico, the indigenous land tax piece is not actually something that's been introduced, but just I know some folks are talking about that. So that's all. Here's my contact information. I think Abby will share the link to the land policy website if she hasn't already with you all. And then also we have this link. It's a place where you can sign up if you want to get updates on our land policy campaign and the work that we're doing at our land program at Young Farmers Coalition. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Chelsea. And just to those of you who are joining, welcome. Thanks so much for being with us. Next, we're going to turn it over to Megan, who's with the Agrarian Trust, and she'll talk about Agrarian Trust's ways of really rethinking what land ownership means.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and really appreciative, Holly, of your setting the stage for sort of what's going on with land right now and the history of land access. So my name's Megan. I use she, her pronouns. I work for Agrarian Trust. I'm both a staff member and also sit on the board of the Vermont Agrarian Commons. I'm calling in today from Abenaki territory in Vermont. I also, most of my time actually is spent with NOFA Vermont, the Northeast Organic Farming Association, supporting beginning farmer programming. And so I do part-time work with Agrarian Trust and specifically work on the commons. And I'm just going to start a timer for myself so I don't go too long. My background is in diversified vegetable farming. And, I think after college, I started farming and have always really loved it. And over time, got a little burnt out. And also, I never owned my own farm, but really just experienced a lot of deep stress and burnout amongst the farmers that I was working with. And so while there's so much joy that is had and can be had from farming and working the land and growing food and feeding the community, and those are all sort of the reasons that I was excited about farming, I also over time really started to see the things that were really hard about it, and just drew me to really search for other solutions, like recognizing the problems. And one of the things that I also do is I'm part of the Vermont Young Farmers chapter Young Farmers Coalition chapter. And I'm just very aware that land access is one of the most challenging pieces for new farmers starting farms. And so I over time sort of was drawn into this idea of more collective and cooperative models. And that is what led me to the work of Agrarian Trust, to think about how, just to address this individualism that comes with farming and just sort of like having to really just work so hard to make ends meet. And how can we sort of look to models that are more commons-based, that can share both the burdens of farming and specifically land access and also the joys of it. So I'm going to share my screen and talk to you all a little bit about Agrarian Trust. Whoops. All right. So Agrarian Trust is a national land trust, and there's a few different sort of pieces of the trust. For time's sake, I'm going to focus on the commons, and I'll share sort of the basics of the Agrarian Commons model, and then a few details about the mechanics of the model, and then some examples of recently formed commons around the country. So I think I'll skip the context piece. I think Holly did a really great job at sort of sharing the context for where we're at and why sort of alternatives are needed. We're in a time in which there's a lot of land changing hands, and there's an extreme lack of equity in who is owning land. And I think the other sort of like big theme that has been raised is just this idea of ownership. And so the commons is a structure, a legal structure that basically changes the rather than an individual farmer owning land and operating their business on land that they own, it changes that structure. It creates a structure for a community to own land together. And I'm just trying to think how like general to be, and then I'm going to go a little bit more specific. Basically, what the commons is doing is it's addressing this issue of land access that can be a real financial burden for farmers. So it provides lifetime, inheritable, and equitable lease tenure for sustainable farmers. And it also removes the land from the commoditized market, which is part of the reason why land is so inaccessible to farmers right now, is because it's kind of on the real estate market, and just the land prices are continuing to rise, farm revenue is continuing to drop, and there needs to be a shift in order to make land more accessible. I just want to mention that the Agrarian Commons model is one solution, and certainly not the only solution to these issues. And also just be very clear that it's not really a new idea, but more sort of a collection of a structure that's created on a foundation of other structures that already exist. So one of the things to point out is just as far as the land trust aspect, that the commons model sort of takes the lessons of a conservation land trust and a community land trust, and in some ways combines them to really focus on agriculture and community. It also draws lessons from the CSA concept, thinking about sort of the way that many members pay into a farm and then receive a share of that farm's harvest. It's sort of a similar concept with land. So it would be like multiple community members sort of sharing the ownership and reaping the benefits of a land base. Also draws influence from cooperatives. The Terre de Lens and Boudin movement are, Terre de Lens is in France, and the Boudin movement is in India. I would encourage you all to learn more about those, and I'm going to skip forward just to make sure we have enough time for folks and to get into discussion. So basically, the land is owned locally as a 501c2 structure. It's governed by a commons board. And the commons board is intentionally comprised of 1/3 farmer leaseholders, 1/3 community members, and 1/3 agrarian trust staff representation. So then this land that is commonly owned and commonly governed gets conveyed in a 99-year lease to a farmer with farm business. And so I think that is something important to point out, that the leases can be conveyed to farm businesses that are functioning as a collective, but not necessarily always. And in a lot of cases, functionally, the farm businesses are continuing to function the same way that they always have, except that instead of having a lot of debt burden on their land, they're able to pay for the land using lease payments, which are much more affordable for the farmers. And then those lease payments get reinvested back into the commons and into those farm businesses. And I think one of my colleagues, Eliza, reminded me to share that the commons is also about creating legal entities that can be enjoyable. So we're asking about how do we create low burden or maybe even liberating legal structures. And the idea is that agrarian commons have really low administrative burden, high flexibility, and the ability to focus exclusively on caretaking land. So we're ensuring equitable farmland access and relationships among people, land, and community. And so donations have to come in to acquire the land. And that is sort of like, one thing we can maybe talk a little bit more about is that the land still needs to be purchased. So money still needs to be raised to make that purchase, but there's not a need for funder involvement or oversight. So again, that land, once it comes into the commons, is locally governed, which is really, really important. And then just to lift up again that the budget that, so all the income coming into the commons in the form of those lease payments then gets reinvested back into the land and the farmers. So in May of 2020, there were 10 agrarian commons that launched across the country, and you'll see the map here, and 2 more were just added. It's important to share that the first commons are located in areas of great importance, need, and impact. There's also a couple of examples of commons, specifically in the New England area, one right here in Vermont, where there's quite a few agricultural resources in these states, but the sort of reason to bring them on early was because these commons were sort of primed for success with the resources that did exist. And it felt important to make sure we had some examples of commons that could really take off quickly and get the ball rolling quick and leverage a lot of resources and interest in the model. I just want to share a couple of examples. So as I said, there's 10 different commons. We added 2 more, so there's a total of 12. And there's kind of a variety of different contexts in which the commons begin. So some, like the Southwest Virginia Agrarian Commons and the Little Tuba Central Maine Agrarian Commons, started with people and farmers and community that were looking for land. So for example, in Southwest Virginia, that's Cameron Terry, you see pictured. Him and his partner Chloe operate garden variety harvests. That's farming within backyards of folks, and they're really looking to make their business long-term sustainable on a piece of land. And so the commons in Southwest Virginia is forming around with this founding farm of garden variety harvest, but they don't have a land base yet. So they're looking for that right now. And if you go to our website, I can drop some links after this presentation. There's some more information about their land search. And then in Central Maine, the commons there came together around the Somali Bantu Community Association, which was a collection of farmers who had been continually operating on leased land and losing their tenure. So again, like Holly said, it's not really about owning the land. It's really about having secure tenure and being able to make decisions that you can know that you'll be secure on that land long term. Others started with land and are looking for farmers. So in Puget Sound, Washington, the Agrarian Commons there started with a big land donation that was made. Someone who left their land to Agrarian Trust, and now the Commons Board there is going to be undergoing an RFP process to bring on a farmer to farm that land. And then others started with farms and very established farm businesses on land that was not secure, or sustainable or affordable long-term, but by putting the land into the commons that will change this. So this diagram too also helps to illustrate a little bit about how the commons structure works. This is West Virginia. It has come together around New Roots Community Farm, which is operating on land that was purchased in 2016 by the Fayette County Farmland Protection Board, and bringing this land into the commons will provide affordable land access for this business to continue, and it will allow the farmers, again, their payments on the land will be significantly smaller, and then they'll be able to redirect those funds that would be going toward the land towards more investments in soil and ecosystem health and regenerative practices. And I think that's another just sort of thing to highlight before I wrap up here, is that a lot of times farming practices are what get sacrificed when the cost of land is too high. And so by decreasing the cost of land, where farmers are then hopefully able to invest those funds into the sustainable and regenerative practices on their farm. And then the last example that I'll share is the Vermont Agrarian Commons. Again, I sit on the board of this commons, and it formed around Bread and Butter Farm, which some of you might be familiar with. Well established, has been around for about 10 years, really based in community, lots of education programs. There's also a couple of businesses alongside Bread and Butter Farm that operate sort of all in the same constellation, like on the same land base. They have a cafe and a music program for children. And they are interested in expanding their land base. They're based in South Burlington, which is under extremely high development pressure. And so by being able to partner with Agrarian Trust, in the case of Vermont, the Vermont Land Trust has raised a great deal, like over $3 million of conservation funds to make this land affordable for the farmers. And yet there's still, over $1 million left that they would need to pay to expand onto this land. So the partnership with Agrarian Trust will allow them to fundraise for the remaining sort of gap in funding and bring the land into the commons. Again, it will no longer be owned by individuals, but by the community, and just be able to remain a community resource in perpetuity. And then the bylaws of the commons also reference specific agricultural practices, which is different than other ways of conserving land, which sort of say, like, these are the things you can't do on it. The common structure really emphasizes sort of what you can do and how to keep your farm, have your dollars invested in those regenerative practices. So I'll wrap up there. I think the last thing I'd love to talk more about during the question and answer is farmer housing, which is another really important piece of the land picture. And Vermont is doing some really cool work to model some new structures for what that could look like to make it possible for farmers to live on the land, which is also a big challenge when we talk about this. So thanks for having me again. Great to be here. And I'll pass it back to you, Katie.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Megan. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea, who's going to talk about some of the New England policy work she's doing with the American Farmland Trust.
Hi, everyone. All right, I'm going to share my screen.
Megan, we might need you to stop sharing.
There we go. Okay. All right. So thank you. It is an honor to be here this evening. As Katie mentioned, my name is Chelsea Gazzillo, and since I agreed to do this panel, my title at American Farmland Trust has changed. So I am now the American Farmland Trust New England policy manager, and in Connecticut, I lead the Working Lands Alliance, which is a broad-based statewide coalition dedicated to saving farmland from development, keeping farmers on the land, and promoting sound farming practices. And in this new role that I'm taking on with American Farmland Trust, I am starting to do more of this work throughout the New England region. In addition, I reside in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is on Nipmuc land, and I am also a co-director for the Holyoke Food and Equity Collective, where I work locally to promote food sovereignty and advance local food system policies. And so I've been asked to ground us in Connecticut and what farmland access work looks like in Connecticut. And before I get started, I thought it might be good to give everyone an overview of the current state of farmland in the Nutmeg State. So this map is a map of Connecticut that we created as part of a report that American Farmland Trust released in, hold on one second, in 2020, called Our Farms Under Threat, the State of America's Farmland. This shows how much land was lost to development in Connecticut from 2001 to 2016. It's probably pretty hard to see, but the report draws on distinctions between acres that were irreversibly converted to urban and highly developed, or UHD, uses, and those that were impacted by low density residential development, or LDR, uses. So Connecticut saw almost 23,000 acres of farmland compromised to development pressures between that 2001 and 2016 time period. These pressures included housing development, solar siting on prime and important farmland, and factors that were contributed to land loss as a result of climate change. Connecticut has one of the oldest farmland preservation programs in the country. It was established in 1978, and the program has done a relatively good job in responding to these development pressures. Since its inception, the program has permanently protected over 46,000 acres, or 386 farms. However, as the pandemic has shown us, more people are choosing to make Connecticut their home, which is also driving up the cost of farmland on the speculative market, and further leading to, or further hindering, farmland access efforts for that young and beginning farmers are trying to access land. All right, so now, like Holly did, I want to ground us in what farmland access in Connecticut looks like. Holly did a really good job grounding us in this perspective on the national level. So according to the 2019 agricultural census, Connecticut has some of the highest cost of farmland on the speculative market. The average price is a little over $12,200 per acre. We have the third highest price of farmland per acre in the country after Rhode Island and New Jersey. And this is a good quote that came out of a farmland access report I wrote in 2020 with the help of Susan Mitchell, who's on this call and will be a farmer presenting after me on the Connecticut farmer perspective. But one of the beginning farmers that we spoke to as part of this report said, "It's such a downer to spend years looking for land to farm, driving by properties with acres and acres of prime farmland on your way to look at some swampy, rocky property that's still too expensive and really far away from markets and population centers. I think it's a real hardship that a beginning farmer will not even have that perfect farm property on their list of affordable properties." And this farmer also said that one of the biggest challenges is oftentimes they would look at, or she would look at raw land, and there would not be a house. And so I would love to have that conversation about housing as well, Megan, during the Q&A. So the high price of farmland has fueled a continual reliance on leased land. And I think Holly and Megan both did a great job in outlining why leased land doesn't always lead to secure land tenure and can hinder a farmer's efforts to build a reliable customer base, being able to invest in climate smart agricultural practices and other infrastructures, and the insecurity, stress of not knowing if at any point the landowner you're leasing from might get a better offer or decide to sell. And like I said, all the other things Holly mentioned. So according to the 2017 Census of Agriculture, there are very few Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in the state. Less than 3% of Connecticut's producers are BIPOC. There are 156 BIPOC fully owned farms in the state, according to the 2017 census. This is compared to the 4,234 farms that are owned by white people. I also just want to note that the census data are limited in terms of who they, in terms of who the who NAS is able to reach and capture in their data collection efforts. All right, so how is Connecticut responding? And like I said, I just want to focus on this from a state perspective. So there are a lot of nonprofits and land trusts that are working to address farmland access and to increase farmland access opportunities, but I will just be looking at this in terms of what state programs and state policies exist to help with farmland access. So the state does have Connecticut Farmlink. Connecticut Farmlink is funded through the Community Investment Act, which is a real estate conveyance fee that every homeowner and property owner pays when they purchase a home or land in Connecticut. Farmlink is a clearinghouse and connecting service for farmland owners and farmland seekers. It's kind of like a dating service that connects the two. According to American Farmland Trust Farms Under Threat New England Perspective report, which is on our website. I keep the report on my desk. Connecticut has the second best state-funded FarmLink program in the country. However, as you can see, there are 491 farmland seekers on the website and 96 parcels listed for purchase or a lease. So there are still a lot more people looking for land, and there is not a huge supply of land for farmers to be able to invest in and or lease. Like I mentioned, the state has one of the oldest farmland preservation programs that has done a good job purchasing development rights from farmers. The agency also has the authority to do what is called buy, protect, sell, or what Connecticut calls buy, protect, farm. So that means the state can buy land at its fee simple value, protect it with an agricultural easement, and then go and sell it to a farmer, or I'm sorry, they can sell it to a nonprofit or municipality at its discounted rate, and then the municipality or land trust can, or nonprofit can then go and sell it to a farmer. This provision was also made legal at the federal level in the 2018 Farm Bill. And then, like I mentioned, when I read that quote, the Connecticut Department of Agriculture convened a farmland access working group in 2019 that wrote a report outlining the challenges that beginning farmers looking to expand their operation, and farmers looking to pass their land to the next generation face in Connecticut. The recommendations, or the report also had recommendations that were just programmatic recommendations as to how the Department of Agriculture and service providers could help facilitate more farmland access transfers. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight some policies that are currently being discussed at the state level that would help with farmland access. One being the option to purchase at agricultural value. So this would be an extra deed restriction that the Connecticut Department of Agriculture could authorize as part of their farmland, as part of the state's farmland preservation program. This deed restriction would be extra funding that a farmer would get so that when the time of sale came up, they would have to sell their land to another farmer. So this authority would make it so that there would be more farmer to farmer land transfers in the state. There is also a provision called a beginning farmer tax credit. This provides tax credits to landowners who rent or sell their land to a new and beginning farmer. And then there's the young farmer farmland purchase and preservation loan programs. Delaware has this program. Many states and municipalities offer assistance for first-time home buyers. So this would be very similar to that, but would be applicable to farmland. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm way over my 7 minutes. And if you have any questions, or if you ever want to nerd out with me on farmland access policy in New England, here is my contact. And I'll leave it there.
Super. Thank you so much, Chelsea. So last but definitely not least, I'm really glad that we have Susan Mitchell joining us to share a farmer perspective on the topic of farmland access. So with that, I'll hand it over to Susan.
Thank you, Katie and Yale, for convening this discussion. My name is Susan Mitchell. I'm the owner and operator of Cloverleaf Farm, and I am a first-generation farmer. I am a beginning farmer, and a lot of the topics that we've been, touched on has certainly rung true with me in my journey through agriculture. Just real brief background, I began farming in the Hudson Valley of New York when I was apprenticing on a farm, and then ended up in Connecticut just by chance for an opportunity at a farm, and have bounced around and worked for different farms until I finally decided I was going to start my own, and that was in 2014. And I moved my farm then 3 times. Farmed on 3 different pieces of land, all under leases that were short term. I've been searching for permanent farmland for years and years, and the first piece of land I actually looked at was in 2011. And so I guess I'm somewhat of a success story because I have now farmland that I kind of own, but I'll get to that in a little bit. I know a lot of farmers, a lot of my peers in agriculture are not farming anymore because they could not get secure land tenure. And I know people that have stopped farming and that have left the state because of various land access issues. So this is definitely a crisis that we're in that hopefully I can shed a little perspective on. And I will start to share my screen just to provide a little bit of context, just with some photos so that y'all can see where it is that I am now. This is Columbia, Connecticut, which is northeastern Connecticut, about half an hour, 20 minutes east of Hartford. This is on Mohegan land. And interestingly enough, I got some documents from the sellers here, and there have been white Europeans farming here since 1812. And the road that I'm on has a lot of these old New England farms. And for a variety of reasons, I think this was probably great for our indigenous communities because I have a beaver pond in the back and water access, and it's a beautiful spot, and I feel very lucky to have ended up here. And it was really almost by dumb luck that it happened. So like everyone's story, it's no 2 farms are the same and no 2 stories are the same. I began years ago sending out emails to everyone in my agricultural network and my CSA members saying, I want to buy a farm. These are the things that I'm looking for. And I really spelled it out, put it out into the universe. And I really felt, because I had moved my farm so many times, I needed a place that was permanent. I need to invest in my soil. I need to be able to plant perennial crops. I need to be able to build structures. I need to be able to grow my business. I couldn't do any of that long term where I was. So I was on 2 acres of leased land and searching and searching. looking to the future while still farming, you know, on this one piece of land. So that has its own challenges. Long story short, a CSA member forwarded my email to her mom, who knew that this woman who owned this farm had passed away. I got her name. I went through the town GIS land records. I found their address. I sent them a letter in the mail. They had never heard from them. I sent them a postcard, never heard from them. I was gonna send another postcard, and then I finally got an email back from the heirs, the children who had inherited this property, who grew up here. And it was essentially a year-long process of kind of that courting phase, you know, to get to know you. Are you going to be okay? Do you want this property? Do you want me to have this property? What are you going to do here? The seller was excited about having it in agriculture and not go to development. She was very patient, not in a rush to sell. So we had a lot of things going for us. What we did not have going for us was that this property appraised at close to $750,000. So clearly I don't have that kind of money. I farm full time for a living, and I don't have a trust fund or anything to support a purchase like that. So the property is 90 acres. We did a lot of work with a service provider who works with beginning farmers here in Connecticut, talking about ideas. Could we separate part of the land? Could we sell some of it to a land trust? Could we reduce the overall size to make it more affordable? Nothing was really panning out. Meanwhile, my existing 5-year lease was running out, and I knew that like I had to find a place to go. And having searched for so long, you know, I've used FarmLink, I've used New England Farmland Finder. I have a huge network through the NOFA and Connecticut Farm Bureau, and I know a lot of people, but still getting access to land is just the utmost challenge. And so I was really getting in a crunch. This seemed like it was a possibility. It was still wildly expensive to enter into the state preservation program. That is a multi-year long process, which is expecting a seller to hold onto property for at least 2 years, you know, while they go through those very slow government roles or government channels to actually sell the development rights to reduce the value of the property. So that wasn't an option. Enter in a private investment firm called Dirt Capital Partners, who Holly certainly knows a number of the folks that work there. Dirt Capital is a small impact investment group who invest in farmers and farmland in New England and New York and a couple other northeastern states. And they essentially partner with a farmer really, and they are the buyers. So they are able to take a property off the market right away and pay cash for it. I in turn have a lease agreement with Dirt Capital. I pay them a lease for this entire property, and eventually, hopefully in 5 years, I will buy it from them. So here's my property. It's, you know, 90 acres, most of it's wooded, never to be farmed. A small portion of it is open tillable acres. As with any farmer, what I care about is the soil, especially as a vegetable grower. That's the most important thing. So we did a lot of soil testing in the beginning, figuring out the quality of the ground, which was going to be suitable for vegetables. You know, sketch things out, figuring out what this future might look like here. There are multiple structures on this property and the fields. And I have to say that of all those things that I listed of what I wanted in a property, this pretty much has it all. I mean, it's like kind of miraculous that this has happened. This house dates from 1838, big traditional white farmhouse, cow barn that, you know, is classic red barn, has some issues, but it looks cute. And then there is a really unattractive but very functional 2-story double-decker chicken house. This used to have chickens in it. Back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Eastern Connecticut had a huge chicken industry, and there were just hundreds of these coops all over this area, and they're mostly just falling apart and disintegrating right now. This is in really good shape, and this will actually be the heart of the Cloverleaf Farm operation. And I know we're a little crunch for time, so I'm just going to cut it off there. And this is my contact information. Druid Capital Partners, if there's any farmers listening who want to talk to them, certainly I can help shepherd you through that. And yeah, we'll go for questions. I'll turn it back to Katie.
Great, thanks, Susan. Maybe if you want to stick in the chat, if there's ways if folks want to buy your veggies over the summer, how they would do that. And so, yeah, we are into our Q&A session, and I would love to start with the question that Adam posed. He asked if there's any agreements with towns or municipalities for how publicly owned land can be used for food production, and or how landowning nonprofits or private institutions have partnered with local farmers towards the same goal. So Chelsea, Holly, Megan, Susan, anyone want to jump in on Adam's question?
Yes. Yes. I have seen people doing this across the country, working with municipalities, and I don't know if trying to share specific examples is helpful, or if just kind of knowing that, yeah, that is a thing that people do. It really just depends on local interest, and if a municipality is willing to consider that, and where they have the source of funding. And how involved they are, whether it's just simply a lease or if it's actually the municipality putting some infrastructure on the land for the farmers. And yeah, slow progress. I've heard that also from other people, that that can be a real problem or challenge with this route for land access. And yeah, I won't speak to specifics in Connecticut, but maybe other panelists want to address that. But if this can be something that sometimes advocacy and different routes around advocacy can help with, of just like putting some pressure on, or raising some awareness that there's desire, and again, like not knowing the exact situation, I'll probably leave it there. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll just echo a lot of what Holly said and add that there are specific examples of this happening in other parts of Connecticut. I know in Bridgeport, for example, Reservoir Community Farms, which is the city's only urban farm, is on city-owned land and is rented by a nonprofit. And I would also just echo what Holly said about getting or doing advocacy around this, putting pressure on Hampden local officials and or state officials to help shepherd along this process if it's hindering you being able to start planting this upcoming season, if you're trying to get on the land before the growing season. I do know a few people that live in Hampden, so if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to connect you.
Great, thank you both. So this isn't a question in the Q&A box, but I heard both Megan and Chelsea reference what a challenge affordable housing is with regards to farmland conservation and farmland access. And so would love for the two of you to share a couple more thoughts there, and Holly and Susan to jump in as well. Maybe Megan, if you want to start. And then...
Yeah, I can start, and if it's okay, I failed to put my contact information up, so I'm just going to share that real quick for the recording while I'm answering the question. I So Corey Pierce is one of the owners of Bread and Butter Farm, and the initial conversation that I had with her, like before any of the commons work started with them, was really like, that was one of her number one issues, is they've been on this land, and Corey currently owns a piece of land that they're using for Bread and Butter Farm. So, but it's conserved, and there's a house lot that's available, but there's no bank that will lend them money to build a house on conserved land. And so that has just been a real issue. I mean, she and her family are renting a house across the road. And I think this is something that comes up for a lot of other farmers. And so in the, I'll take this, I'll stop the share. But in this conversation about farmland access, I think especially with the work that we're doing with Agrarian Commons, like the idea, and so much of the work that all of you are doing, is the idea of secure tenure for a long time. And, with Agrarian Commons, it's not only about that current generation, but the structure is also built to be easily transferred to the next generation and keep this land in sustainable farm production in perpetuity. And I think that we can't talk really about that without thinking about, like, how are all these farmers going to live on the land that they're farming? And so Bread and Butter Farm, they have this big farm team. They have at least 3 other families who would live on the land as well. And so in the process of bringing in this additional land base around them, they are working very closely actually with Vermont Land Trust, but also with their with South Burlington, the city of South Burlington, to create an exclusion from the conservation area so that they can put in some affordable farmer housing, and also incorporate some requests from the town to create, I think there might be a rec field involved or some trail. So it's the idea of this exclusion will also allow them to put in a farm hub and expand their farm store and really make it a community base. So that's just one example from Vermont, but I've heard that from other farmers too, that housing on conserved land is a real issue. So I don't know, Chelsea, I'd be interested to pass it to you and hear. It sounds like you have some examples as well.
Yeah, well, housing on protected land in Connecticut is definitely an issue, and a lot of rural municipalities have single housing zoning laws. So you can't have like multiple, I'm sorry, it's really late. You can't have like duplexes or multiple family houses on many of the lots, or in many of the houses or infrastructure that already exist on protected land per the local zoning laws. And so this is definitely something that has been coming up more and more as the state is trying to address affordable housing needs and looking at the future of farming and agriculture. There is an organization called Desegregate Connecticut that is being spearheaded by a woman at Yale named Sarah Bronin. She's actually the Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin's wife. And she was on Where We Live, I think 3 days ago, talking about this very issue. Well, she was talking about affordable housing, and the program brought on somebody from farmland, a farmer named Terry Jones, to speak to this. And the segment didn't really come to any conclusions, but I guess as somebody that works in farmland protection, I would love to know the answer. Like, how can both coexist? How can we look at the future of conservation easements to allow for more duplexes, to allow for more multi-family homes? And yeah, I don't know, Megan, maybe this is something that we could talk about. And then also looking at the conservation or farmland protection, and how we can use funding from farmland protection to allow for more community land trust is something that I've been thinking about, because I do think that that is another way that we could address the affordable housing issue.
Holly or Susan, anything the two of you want to add?
I'll also say that a lot of quote unquote farm properties that are listed on the MLS or the general, marketplace are priced according to the value of the house. It's how we value real estate, is the home. And as farmers, we're looking at what is the value of the land. I'd much rather have a great barn than a great house any day. Working farmers are not looking for granite countertops and big kitchen islands. We have very different priorities, and our system is not set up to reflect those needs. So it's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is just based on what Susan was saying too, sometimes housing can come into play as a challenge in the land access process. If there's not a house on the land, you can have more difficulty getting a bank to lend to you for purchasing the land because they see the house as their main collateral or their asset value that they're going to be able to resell and recapture value if you default on the loan. So if you're just trying to buy bare land, you might have to work with a specific ag lender rather than it might narrow your options, and it might also increase your interest rate, or it might make your loan terms less favorable. So there's definitely some challenges there.
Great, thanks to all of you. I feel like there's an interesting convergence happening between the community land trust movement and the conservation land trust movement, like Megan was talking about, but also the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust and other land trusts that are really focused on centering access and equity seem to be moving in that direction, which is really neat to see. I think I would love to dig maybe a little bit deeper into a question that Lauren posed in the Q&A, and Susan answered it, but I feel like what your question gets to, Lauren, which is what are the most important factors for farmers in finding land to own, is a good question for thinking about all of these factors and influences. So I'd be curious to hear from Chelsea or Megan or Holly or Susan, what are some of the surprising influences on farmland access? I think we've talked a lot about housing as one area that is critical, but are there other factors that the farmers you've worked with or you yourself have thought about that might surprise folks in the audience with regard to what farmland is best for their needs?
I think there's probably a lot of different things to answer to this question. I think one thing that comes up a lot is access to markets. And that is maybe by non-farmers sometimes overlooked, like how important it is to be able to to sell your product. Like it sounds it's almost silly to say it, but also in my work with NOFA Vermont, we spend a lot of time with farmers on marketing. And the closer you are to a urban center, often the easier it is to sell your products. So that's just one thing that's coming to mind. I'll let other folks answer, and I'll kind of keep thinking through. But I do think that that's kind of a piece that's important. And when we think about sort of alternative models of farming, I think that's just one that's really important to consider, is like how at the end of the day, like if you're going to make money on this farm, you have to be able to sell your product, and you have to be able to access those people who are going to purchase the food. So
I'm going to defer to Susan for most of the answer to this question, but one thing I always hear farmers say is soils, like how good are the soils? In Connecticut, we do have some good farmland soils. Some may say they're the best in the country. But yeah, there are properties that are really rocky or not tillable or just not desirable for farming. And so if you're looking at a raw piece of land, getting somebody to go out there and look at the soils is like the first thing I hear that farmers want to do. Susan, do you want to add anything to that since you are the Connecticut farmer?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to answer this. I mean, it depends on what you produce on your farm. You know, the needs of a livestock farmer are different from a vegetable farmer, than a fruit grower, than, you know, dairy or hay. Like, so it's hard to say these are the, you know, A, B, C, D, these are the things that we look for, because it is so different. But and access to market is certainly one of them, but that also depends on how you're selling your product. You know, it's not uncommon for people to drive an hour or more to get to a market, you know, and I actually think that's reasonable. I happen to market to my community through a CSA program, so my customers are very close to me, although as a lot of businesses like mine grow, we are taking our product further and further and further away from the farm just to be able to sell more. Yeah, it comes down to the land base. I mean, more than I feel like than anything else, and every farmer needs something a little different.
I don't have a ton to add, but I will just say that I think another point to this question is just that acknowledging that where you farm is also where you live, and that there is a lot there that is just like, I talked to a lot of farmers who, you know, might be able to find land, but all these different factors are coming together. And it's like, is it close to family, or is it in a school district where you would, if you're planning to have kids, like want them to go, or are there cultural resources around that are fitting? Do you feel safe in that community? And so there can be a lot of these kind of social factors as well that play in besides the physical land base, that I think are really important. And, you know, I've had conversations on two ends of the spectrum that stand out to me, like some with individuals who live in very rural places who say there's tons of land here, it's very affordable, like why don't young farmers want to come here? And that can be part market access, part, you know, maybe it's really just not a community that feels welcoming to them as humans besides being as farmers. And on the other end, have also talked to, and not to pick on New Jersey, but just had this very distinct conversation with some folks in New Jersey who were very, very eager to make farmland access a possibility, but we're feeling like, where are all the young farmers? We have incredible market access here. And, you know, my hunch, and the thing that's kind of hard to solve for and hard to explain, is that it didn't feel like it's not really a desirable community for young farmers, and doesn't feel welcoming in that way. So that can play into and be much harder to solve for. But.
Thank you all. So I see some good questions continuing to filter in, but I also don't want to keep people on Zoom for longer than 75 plus or minus minutes, because I know that screen fatigue is real. So if you do have more of a Zoom appetite, we've got kind of an informal, more typical Zoom room that we will hop into just after this webinar. And, you know, we could all see each other's faces and chat a little more. But for those of you who have to go, I'd love to just end with one more question, which is, I'd love for each panelist just to say like a word or a sentence or something that is bringing you hope or fueling your fire with regard to this topic right now.
I'm pretty jazzed on following Chris Newman on social media. I would recommend to others. He's got some pretty strong ideas and opinions, and identifies as Indigenous and Black, and is building this idea of a community food system. And I think a lot of the ideas that he is acting on are really exciting and really interesting, and are things that I've seen what it's exciting to me about it is not just exactly what he's doing, but that I've seen this theme kind of picking up around the country. And I think it's a percolating social moment. And I'm excited that it feels like people are ready to talk about flipping the script on what farmland access and ownership has to look like. And there are so many organizations and individuals, like Agrarian Trust also, and Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, and there's a lot of organizations kind of percolating in this moment. So that was way more than a word, but that's what I'm excited about.
I am often super pessimistic about any of this getting better. And that's just because I've sort of lived the reality that I have. But I am super pumped about the Agrarian Trust. I mean, I follow them on social media. I'm really excited that someone is entering another concept and idea into this universe. So I'm really excited to see where that goes.
I'm really excited about all of the people out there who are farming in these times and persevering through so many barriers that make farming really challenging, and making it joyful, and just continuing to serve as models for how we can better relate to the land and ourselves and each other.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what everyone else said. I think what's giving me hope and what's like driving me forward right now is it feels like everyone is starting to wake up as to how broken our food system is, and land is at the heart of our food system. And so, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted markets when it first hit, and then the killing of George Floyd. And so now there are a lot of really inspiring federal and state policies, like Holly showed us at the beginning of this presentation or this seminar, that are addressing both land access and racial justice. And 5 years ago, I don't know if I would have seen that happening. And so that's giving me like a lot of hope and inspiring me to be more courageous in the work that I'm doing.
Well, thank you all so much, both for those most recent words, but also for what you've shared over the last little bit, and for the work that you all do each day. So let's all clap from our respective homes and say thank you. And maybe we'll see some of you in the Zoom room. Abby put the chat in the link in the chat, but thank you all so much for joining us.